fascinating hour spent talking about the possibilities of how technology can unlock both medical care as well as healthcare, and just the fascinating stuff that is happening both on the technology side and biosciences. I read somewhere very recently that, it took us 200 years to improve life expectancy from an average of 30 years to something like 60 years. That was from the beginning of the 19th century to the beginning of the 21st century. But if you look at the trajectory since then, most data predicts that it will probably take just a tenth of that, or 20 years to now improve life expectancy by another 30 years to something like 90. And that's just sort of the dramatic way in which technology and advancements in biosciences are working together to help improve quality of lives.
Some of us have more investment in that than others.
Sure.
Come on, let's get it going.
Yeah. So I wanted to, help contextualize this discussion by bringing it, to home, which is India. And if we look at our healthcare system, it is really constrained by three very severe challenges. There's clearly an affordability challenge. We are a low per capita economy, but almost 70 to 80% of our healthcare is financed by people's incomes, and that puts a lot of burden on people. We have an access issue. If you look at healthcare infrastructure or even availability of healthcare professionals, any metric, it's way, way low in India, right? And then we also have an accuracy challenge, availability of data, regulations, and things like that, right? So when you think about an economy like this, which is plagued with all three, severe constraints, what specific technologies, would be applicable to an environment like this and can sort of help us manage this challenge, that sort of coexist? And maybe, Vishal, would like to hear your perspective on that.
Sure, Rishab, and pleasure to be here, first of all. So, rightly put, a country that has affordability, accessibility, accuracy issues, three A's, what exactly do you do and how do you do it better? I think one big context that we need to put in place is the fact that this is a country of healthcare consumers, right? So when 70% of your country pays out of pocket, this is where consumerism really begins to breed and breed well. Also because if such a large segment of the population is paying out of pocket, your ability to innovate services, innovate technology for this group of people becomes all the more imminent. So the way that I see it, I think the big force of personalization that we are currently seeing, and David and John both talked about it in terms of that ultimately it's all about the patient. It's all about centric to the patient. So I believe that one of the big technology areas is around the entire gamut of personalization. And we are beginning to see the early signs of that happen in India, which is whether it's, while we do know, a lot of the stuff that is happening on the mobile today is, quote unquote, has still to be tested out. But I think the fact that there is a lot of personalization that is happening with the mobile-led healthcare applications and technologies, that is something which is going to be remarkable for India in the long run. We are already seeing early trends of consumers wanting to look for doctors, early trends of consumers wanting to look for more affordable healthcare, and so therefore apps which are actually giving them the opportunity of sub-segmenting healthcare providers and seeing what kind of healthcare costs exist in each one of them. And we are seeing very large trends of personalization happening around wellness as far as consumers are concerned. So I very strongly believe that technologies which are led towards personalization and are harbored around personalization are the technologies which are going to do remarkably well from an Indian context in the future.
The real test here is to be able to hold two maybe conflicting ideas in your head at the same time. And I think what Tom and I talked about may represent not conflicting points of view, but they certainly are very different. At the time that we are taking off from a technological point of view to become better and better at the task of repair, diagnosing and treating in the way that Tom described, we have the tools to do what you've just described. And in India, I think it's not an either or. You have to do both. And that's where the opportunity lies. But it takes an amazing amount of steadfastness, financing, public policy support to be able to do both well. The tendency of politicians, whether it's here or in the United States, certainly it is in the United States, is to grab a silver bullet and make that the answer. It isn't. We have to do exactly what Tom described. There are so many things that we can do to make the medical care system function more effectively, both from a productivity point of view and an effectiveness point of view in the way that Tom described, given the breakthroughs that are occurring. At the same time, there's so many things we can do to personalize care with simple solutions that use available technologies in bioscience today. The key thing when you're looking in front of the medical care system is to think simple. This is not, it's rocket science to figure out how to design some of these things and get them out there and get them to scale. I mean, I don't mean to diminish it, but the solutions don't have to be the kind of elegant things that Tom is describing when it gets into difficult diagnosis and treatment, or simulation, the kind of thing that our cancer patient that Tom identified down here, Deepak Atresh, has founded in his company called Aditas. Those are complex kinds of things. But you know, where I was going was using simpler technologies, available technologies, and marrying the bioscience with that, and looking at large populations, and then personalizing in that way.
Yeah, there's, what day is today? Friday. Okay, so on early in the week, early this week, I was in Jiangxi province in China, meeting with the provincial government. And there's a company there that the government is supporting, which is attempting to solve one part of the problem. Dave said it very well. Physicians don't scale, right? China has the same problem India has, that I don't care how much money they throw at the problem, they can't scale their physicians fast enough to meet the healthcare needs. So this company was founded, and it's going to be packed with technology that's scalable to diagnose everything possible without seeing the physical patient. So the patient shows up with certain symptoms. A computer will say, do X, Y, and Z tests, which will all be sent to a central location. This will all be mined, and a single data will go back saying, this patient most likely has this, and this is the therapy. Now, China can do this because it may not have the tort problems that the United States does, right? But if you think about it, it's going to deliver a better result than the humans. And it's scalable. And it's affordable, right? Totally new paradigm combining sort of both what you and I talked about. Yep. New way of delivering care plus a whole bunch of technology. I mean, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed.
Yep. Let me build on what Tom just described. There are two large retailers in China, Suning and Alibaba. Suning has 1,500 retail outlets throughout China. They're putting pharmacies in those retail outlets, and they're putting ready clinics, or basically they're called love centers. That's the word in Chinese. A love center where people come and have exactly what Tom has described. No, not what you're thinking, Tom.
I said, I gotta get
there. Yeah, I know, I kind of like that idea. Well, you know. But I think it's really fascinating to put that together with what you just described. If you think about it in India, where would these opportunities be? Not to bypass, you need a physical space, or at least to have that as an alternative, and you need to do some things online, which is what Alibaba and also Suning does. But it's a fascinating way to put this together, and again, it doesn't make you dependent on scaling through the physician, which is not possible.
Right.
You know, and that brings me to an interesting thought, which is if you think about chronic diseases, Tom, and you talked about the fact that globally, you know, increasingly the burden of diseases now on chronic diseases, you know, and the life cycle, if you think about the life cycle of chronic disease as just awareness and then actual treatment and management, right? Do you feel that technology can play a more disruptive role on maybe the awareness and the management side, and actually maybe reduce demand on the medical system? I think, David, that's the premise that you were trying to talk about.
Yeah, I think if you look at the quote life cycle of a disease or a chronic illness, in the current model, it is a growing awareness, worry, or awareness of symptoms, going in, getting diagnosed and treated, usually in the medical care setting, and then working out some sort of uneasy alliance between the medical care system and what they're asking you to do and what you have to do to change your behavior at home or your lifestyle, all the things that Tom was talking about. If you really think about the lifestyle, it starts very early, perhaps with prevention, but certainly with early diagnosis, pre-symptomatic diagnostics, which is where genetics and proteomics and metabolomics come in. And if you think about screening, you want to figure out how you get to people, not how you get people to come to you, come to the clinic, come to the hospital. The best places to screen are places where people go, malls, shopping centers, communities, all of those things. That's the first stage. Getting them into a diagnosis and treatment that's appropriate for the illness, given whatever science we have to do that, is the next stage. But then there's surrounding them with all of the tools that help them change their behaviors. Changing behaviors means changing habits. And changing habits are extraordinarily difficult to change. Technology with support can help enormously there. And it can have a dramatic impact on what happens downstream. And let me give you one example. Patients who, in Kaiser Permanente, who required renal dialysis, just to go to an extreme, we had a natural experiment that occurred in one of our facilities when we didn't have enough nephrologists to take care of the patients, so we contracted with private nephrologists in the community. Our nephrologists were surrounded by a team with reminder systems and telephone calls and simple technology, not complex technology. The nephrologists in the community were not. They tried to do it all themselves. The interesting thing was we tracked the emergency room visits in those two populations. And that's where that number I showed, it was about a 70 or 80% higher rate of ER visits in the patients who were treated by a physician acting alone, as opposed to a physician acting with a team of people who did, and the technologies that supported those patients in managing their illness, which happened to be chronic renal disease and requiring renal dialysis.
So Rishab, if you take a look at any private sector or public sector hospital in this country, 50% of the patients who get admitted in our institutions today have chronic diseases, right?
Absolutely.
India is going to be home to about 100 million diabetics and is going to be the diabetic capital of the world. So we are going to be a country which is going to be sick with chronic care and is already sick with chronic care to a very large extent.
Right.
Can this country continue to afford to live with chronic diseases over the next 20, 30 years? The opportunity of actually trying to create solutions around chronic diseases is probably the most dynamic opportunity that healthcare represents in this country.
Absolutely.
There is no doubt about the fact that any healthcare delivery play, any technology play, any application play which happens around chronic diseases in India has to be a winner in the short and the long run. We have not done enough at all in even trying to combat chronic diseases in the community today. So, when we talk about the wellness revolution in India, the wellness revolution has got nothing to do with anything else but to basically combat chronic diseases. Yep. So, if you look at, and I think one of David's slide was that 30 to 50% of the chronic disease cost can be reduced if it is managed well.
Correct.
Right? And then we go back to the basics of what is the problem in India around affordability. So if we can reduce 50% of the cost for chronic disease management in this country, and if there are tools, applications, services, which can actually make and help to make that happen, we can reduce our hospitalizations in this country by about 25 to 30%. And that eventually translates into huge economic savings for an average Indian citizen. So I think when I look at new business models, when I look at new opportunities, I think everybody sitting over here is an entrepreneur in some way. When you look at those opportunities, I think opportunities around chronic diseases and management of chronic diseases is the way to go.
I mean, that's a great point, Vishal. So what do you feel is getting in the way of, the entrepreneurial community or the government or even the healthcare infrastructure, really working proactively towards reducing this burden?
See, I think number one, as a country, we have shut our eyes to the fact that we live with huge amount of chronic disease, right? So education is point number one. We've not only begun to educate ourselves and our communities of the impact of chronic diseases that we as individuals or our families are going to face from an economic perspective. So I think that's number one in terms of a very high decibel education around chronic diseases in the country. Secondly, I think on the regulatory framework and even from the public side, see, I'm of the hypothesis that in this country, if you have to do something, it has to be privately led as far as healthcare is concerned, because the government just has so many other agendas to combat, and a 1.2% GDP spend on healthcare for a country of 1.3 billion people is just not going to get you anywhere. So whatever you need to do through a private lens. So a lot, and I don't think that there are any regulatory hurdles today, and thankfully so, which avoid us from basically trying to reach out to the consumers and sensitizing them about chronic diseases. I think the last but most important is that we just don't have the service network today, which is identifying itself and targeting itself around chronic diseases. And that's why the new ecosystem that is coming up now is beginning to think about it. Applications are beginning to think about it. And there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I don't think that there is any regulatory issue which does not allow us to reach that goal.
I want to add a couple things to what was just said. We have the same problem in the United States. We've not really begun to address the kinds of chronic diseases from the social and population health point of view that we need to. Our interventions are as limited, I think, there as they are here. They're different. I don't mean to make them the same. But as I see it, there are really two streams that we have to follow. And let me go back to experience at Kaiser Permanente when we were asking this question. We did an epidemiologic assessment to determine where we wanted to put a great deal of emphasis in trying to change the curve of utilization, the prevalence of the illnesses, and cost. And we did it entirely by what were the most common chronic illnesses that we faced. We picked the top three. They represented, I can't remember the numbers, but I would bet probably 30 to 40% of the chronic disease burden, the cost at Kaiser Permanente. They were huge. They were not cancer, it was diabetes, adult onset diabetes, it was asthmatics, children and adult asthmatics and cardiovascular care. And we developed a series of programs to intervene in those illnesses. So there's a deep dive that has to go almost chronic illness by chronic illness because there are unique things about each of those that we discovered. But the other thing that is another area of focus is that most of the chronic illnesses have a very major behavioral and lifestyle component that is agnostic. In other words, it doesn't depend on the illness itself. We need greater understanding and better technologies to address the issue of behavior change and habit reformation. And how do we do that using the technologies available, understanding incentives, the triggers that move people to change behaviors? How do we reinforce that? All of those. So we needed both in order to address those issues.
Yeah.
And that's where the personalization bit comes back,
Yeah.
Because if you're able to make people aware and use many of these technologies which make people aware of their personal issues and they can sort of manage their personal issues related to chronic diseases, I think from an India perspective, that's a very targeted way of creating new business models.
Yep.
I'd like to suggest, however, that, and Dave pointed this out, this is not easy stuff to do. And there is still technology that's needed because the problem isn't a person with a single chronic disease with a typical history and a typical way in which it's managed. There's no typical. It's our friend here who smokes, drinks, has unsafe sex, he has cancer, his congestive heart failure, and slightly demented, right? I mean, and all of a sudden we're going to develop an app for that, right? It doesn't work. I mean, the Great Bird Ventures Fund is designed to try to find technologies to get very specific signal out of the noise of data, right? By the way, the fund is still open for a couple of months. If anyone wants to invest, I had to say that. But in any case, this is hard stuff to find.
Yep.
It's hard stuff to do. And we do not expect fast returns.
That's right.
There needs to be patience. Returns will be big, but they're not quick.
Exactly right.
It's complicated stuff.
No, that's spot on, Tom. I think the only advantage that we have is when you start setting these algorithms together, particularly from an India context, with such a high degree of prevalence, and if you do the algorithms right, right, and if you put them all together, the scalability of that is just so massive.
That's right.
Right? So I think that's the big advantage that we have from an India context, that we just have so much of opportunity over here because of the disease burden being so high.
By the way, one of the reasons the disease, remember Nauru that was out there?
Yeah.
So Nauru sits in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in a sort of a desert of the Pacific. So the people who had to reach Nauru, the only people who survived, had huge amounts of calorie conservation genes. And therefore, you give them a little bit of nourishment, they get really fat. By the way, if you look at the Indian subcontinent and you look at genetic prevalence, by the way, you folks are incredibly susceptible to diabetes and coronary artery disease. So you have a genetic susceptibility, probably due to the same kind of screening over time of the population.
You know, since we are on this topic, Rishab, I think the other one that one sees as big opportunity is, again, as you look at the density of chronic disease management. I think one of the other big opportunities that comes out is, excuse me, is this entire area of remote patient management, right?
Yeah.
Remote patient monitoring. Huge, because again, the more and more personalization that begins to happen, the more and more focus on chronic disease management that begins to happen, the more and more is the opportunity around the entire remote patient monitoring and remote patient access opportunity in terms of just helping and translating data between clinicians, providers, consumers. So that's another big area that I believe is
and clearly
waiting to be
this problem,
yeah,
right? Given our
There's another area that's really interesting, which is not in chronic illness, but I think it's one we ought to think about. A very interesting company, now probably 15 years old in the United States, focuses on helping consumers navigate through the medical care system. Turns out that the cost comparisons of people who have access to this service versus those who don't, the employers have witnessed a 20% cost reduction in their treated population. Now, I don't know if this is a well-done study. It was done out of UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, but it's impressively going in the right direction. And what it tells you is there is a huge amount of information that helps consumers navigate through what in effect is like being a ping pong ball in a hurricane. When you have a diagnosis or you're trying to get through the medical care system, you go to this specialist, that service, that imaging, that lab, another specialist, and it's like ping ponging. If you can give consumers a better set of tools to move through that system with better questions, it turns out it costs a hell of a lot less.
and probably you can improve the outcomes.
Oh,
as
the
well.
outcomes are much better, and certainly patient satisfaction is off the charts. Yep.
So the one other theme, I just wanted to get your perspectives on, and then maybe we'll take a few audience questions, is if you're an entrepreneur in this space, in the Indian context, what would be your advice on some of the things that one has to over-index on? What I mean by that is, the one thing that comes to my mind is, healthcare is very personal and people are very sensitive, and there is a huge need to build trust. Building, a business in the healthcare space, it's very important to be able to earn consumers' trust. And it's a bit difficult, or it's a bit more difficult than a consumer goods or a technology business to do that. So what would be your advice to young entrepreneurs who are trying to use technology to solve some of these healthcare challenges?
I'll just give one example, which I think is maybe a partial answer to what you've said. A friend of mine is Anita Promita, who's from, I believe she's from the Gujarat area of India, I can't remember. But Anita is an entrepreneur with another friend of mine in Southern California. And she wanted to do something about depression. and she wanted to do some sort of a screening application that came from the American Psychiatric Association on an iPad. And she wanted to use it as a quick tool to distinguish between people who may be symptomatic or pre-symptomatic and those who aren't. It's a relatively good tool. Doctors generally don't screen well for depression, and yet it's a very common problem that overlays a number of other chronic illnesses and one's ability to respond. Here's what she did to answer that question. First of all, she used something that was scientifically valid. She didn't make it up. She used a tool that came from a vetted scientific set of efforts. And then she sat with consumers herself and watched the way they used the first user interface, the second, the third, the fourth, the 50th, the 100th iteration until it was right for the consumers across a variety of educational backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds. Now, what happens is, if that's valid, you have built your lifeguards. You've got a group of consumers, you've got an application that has been really tested with consumers and it works. And you've got clinicians who see it as useful, helpful in their practice settings. It took her about 2 or 3 years to get through that process. There's no shortcut.
I think I would just echo that. You need to dive deep in the domain.
Yep.
Let's face it, there are some folks that know a little bit about IT, for example, Google. Google Health came, went. Microsoft went in, went out.
Intel.
Enter, in, out,
Yeah.
right? And these are folks that at least I understand, I don't know, have some competence in IT, but their domain knowledge on the healthcare space failed. And so incredibly deep, rigorous domain knowledge, and always conscious in your brain, these are people's lives we're screwing up. It's not, you know, a little video game that's going to frustrate me. This is a person who's anxious, who's a mother, a daughter, and therefore this stuff has to be taken with extreme seriousness.
You like it or not, the physicians are the priests of medicine. And to be able to do something that doesn't require a physician, that bypasses the physician,
And get the consumer's
you
trust as
have
well.
to get that trust. It has to be either blessed by doctors, certainly not thrown out by doctors. I mean, and that's what I said, watch your back earlier. But it has to be as valid as what a doctor does in order to counter the natural tendency that I have as a doctor to make everything medical. If I see a nail, you know, if I've got a hammer, my hammer is medicine, everything looks like a nail to me. And I will medicalize everything. And so if you're going to do it differently, you have to have you have to be damn sure you build on exactly what Tom said, deep domain knowledge, deep understanding.
So, you know, our healthcare ecosystem, and particularly our startup economy on the healthcare side, is just beginning to take roots, and very rightly so, and phenomenally important opportunity for all of us to be into. I think what I would just like to sensitize everybody who's either in this domain or is going to venture into this domain is anything to do with healthcare is science-led, right? And so while whether you are a marketplace aggregator, whether you are delivering a consumer app, if you are just creating a new technology, I think everything has to be led by science first and everything else later. Because this is a sector which is so sensitive, where market reputations of enterprises are made and broken through rampant word of mouth, right? There are times when you go to your family first and ask them which hospitals they went to, and probably disregard sometimes your doctor's opinion just because you had a very good experience because your neighbor said so, your family member said so, your friend said so, right? And so I think that's extremely critical. And what I'm beginning to see happen is somewhere in the rush to do many new things, we are probably losing the eye for science. And that is critical. So anybody who's wanting to venture in there, it's very important to sort of keep that as the single focal point. Because once you've got the science right, then it is all about getting the service right. Then it is all about getting the technology right, and then it's all about getting the ecosystem right.
Sure.
But you've got to start it with the right science, because everything is going to be patient-centric. So a patient is a human being and is composed of stuff which science delivers, right? So I think that's important, and I think the service-led positioning that we are doing of many of our services is phenomenally good. It's just about ensuring that that we don't lose sight on the science.
I just want to come back to this, how you build the trust issue. One of the questions that I think we wrestle with all the time in this field is, what is the organizational model that contributes to trust? And I've always wrestled with this in healthcare in the United States. There's an interesting battle going on in the US between the not-for-profit and for-profit hospital systems. And there is an issue of consumer trust that seems to enter into that conversation. India has chosen a different route. There really isn't the same kind of not-for-profit system build-out that we have in the United States. But there are, I think it needs to be said here, that there are different organizational and financing and social models that can be created under the general term entrepreneur. So for example, Aravind in Kerala is a not-for-profit foundation, and it's doing incredibly innovative, interesting work. Narayana is a different model than Manipal, or is something, I mean, very production-oriented, very, very high throughput-oriented across the spectrum of socioeconomic capabilities, et cetera. So there are many different models, and the issue of trust links to the model. So as we think about science, as we think about remaining close to consumers, we also have to think about how you create the organizations that have the relationship to communities and the population served that build trust. And one of the hardest things to manage, honestly, is this issue of making tons of money off the sickness of people. It's very, very, very difficult. Some do it well, and I think we have examples right here in Bangalore that do. But it's a tough, tough road, especially for a new entrepreneur.
I think those are fantastic insights. So, maybe we have time for a few audience questions. There's one here.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the issue, David, that you just touched upon, that the financial incentives, right, for the providers are not aligned necessarily with the move towards prevention and kind of proactive healthcare instead of sick care. So do you have advice in terms of, I mean, US is trying to go towards these fee for outcomes rather than fee for service through these accountable care organizations and so on. So do you have advice for India again? In addition to the technology piece that you talked about, what should we be doing in terms of these business model changes?
Well, I'll take a swing at it, but I'm sure everybody has an opinion about it. I have been arguing for moving in the direction that we're now seeing happening in the United States. I've been doing that for 40 or 50 years, that moving to a value-based kind of payment system, not a productivity, how much can you do kind of, or an interventional payment system of the fee-for-service traditional sort. So if I were to pick one thing in India, I would certainly figure out ways to have populations, have entities assume risk for populations and be paid for the outcomes they produce. It is absolutely true that when you are paid to take care of a population and provide everything you need to take care of that population, your vision switches from saying, how can I make a ton of money off of doing cardiac care, to how can I take care of this population so they don't need as much cardiac care. And let me give you an example of what happens. The average number of beds per 1,000 people in the United States now is what, about 3.5, yes, close to 4. In Kaiser Permanente, it's 1.3. A hospital is a cost, not a profit center. So you flip the incentives, and that would be terribly important, because there is a huge amount of intellectual capital in this country that if it were focused on the spectrum of care instead of the production of care, because of the incentives, I think would be very different.
Just a quick comment on that from a different viewpoint. One of the very controversial things that's happening now in the healthcare space, in the entrepreneurial space around the world, but in the USA especially, is these novel drugs that are coming out which have huge costs. And, you know, you sit and you watch the entrepreneurs who are developing these things, and they're taking enormous risk with hundreds of millions of dollar bets that can be flushed in a nanosecond when the phase 3 trial crashes. But at the same time, the backlash when a large amount is being charged for this, and this is a problem I don't know how to solve.
Well,
I
think there's an.
Do you know how to solve that problem?
Yes, I think we have a.
Thank
I think
goodness.
we have a way to solve it, and it's sitting right over here. I mean, with a company here in Bangalore called Cellworks. If you can, in fact, develop highly sensitive simulation models of the human cell and the intracellular pathways, as we did with silicon chips.
So you're saying reduce the investment.
You have to reduce
reduce
investment and time.
Yeah, okay, that's right.
And you start moving away from these
that's
massive clinical trials
That's
and
right.
all of the expense and all of the risk. It's a different paradigm for finding solutions that is now being developed here. I think there's many opportunities like that in drug discovery.
Yeah, that could be.
And so I think I think there's an answer coming. And it gets us closer and closer to personalized medicine and the end of one kind of therapeutic intervention as you move that to a production level capability. And by the way, I mean, if you stop and think about a tremendous power that we haven't harnessed in healthcare, it's that simulation and prediction and optimization modeling that is used in other industries. It's the reason we got Moore's Law at Intel in the technology industry. We're starting to apply that in things as disparate as the human cell and the operations of a medical care or a hospital care system, so we can optimize the use of that space and build it more efficiently and faster.
I mean, it's a good thing that we can start to argue, otherwise this gets boring. The only thing I would caution is the mathematical complexity is large. When you look at systems biology, it's an n squared minus n over 2 problem, right? Yeah. It basically exponentially increases. If you were to do the human connectome, right? You want to understand mental disorders by looking at the system of the brain.
Yeah.
And you would use the same math, right? A buck a base pair to a bus of, but we did the math once, it's 2 times the global GDP of the world. Right?
You wonder what makes Siemens profitable when they spend all their time doing this sort of.
But Tom, maybe on a lighter note, iPhone 8 will solve that problem.
We like math. What the hell? But these are tough problems.
Tough problem, very tough. It's easier with optimizing how a medical care system operates, and then designing the buildings to allow you to function at an optimal way. That, from a mathematical and engineering point of view, is a more trivial problem than designing an integrated silicon chip.
That's right.
But moving the other way, what you're describing, is non-trivial. It's very, very difficult.
Well,
There's a gentleman wanting
I have
to
a
ask.
question. I think in the era of patients are really being seen as commodities, I'd like to really get your view or how corporates or the technology partners can influence situation in a country like India. That I'll give an example, like whether it's a stencils or maybe a schizophrenia shots that somebody tried to import or buy from outside country. I see that it's probably X number of a profit margin before it really reaches to the real patient. You know, neither a company nor anybody really benefit out of that. Somebody else is really making a lot of money out of somebody's pain. You know, nobody really makes a real meaningful margin in that phase. So, like, what's a message that you would give to governments or the policymakers or any other kind of technology partners who can try to influence and change things like this, right? It's like more than what the manufacturing company itself makes money when it really reaches the patient. What's your message for this?
Tom?
No, that's your question. That's clearly your question. Go ahead.
The last word.
So basically, what you're trying to ask is that in the entire ecosystem of new invention, there are multiple players who are probably getting incentivized, you know, and by the time the invention reaches the last mile, Many of them do not, and many of these just stay only at the initial stages. Is that, if I get your question right?
Yes, yes.
I think research is always a domain of 5% out of the 95% really succeeds, and sometimes not even 5%, right? So does that mean that we stop doing research? The answer is no. You cannot stop doing research, but you've got to do a lot more targeted research. I think gone are the days of open research, right? Where billions of dollars of research money could have been flowed back, and nobody would even ask or blink an eyelid. But those days are gone, and because research money is just getting more and more dried up, and it's getting very, very targeted. So I think even from an ecosystem perspective, how to ensure that you're doing targeted research rather than just open research, and using your resources the right way, whether on the public side or on the private side, is something that, that is really going to give India some dividend. Otherwise, we just don't have the resources, and I mean, we don't even have institutions which have been funded billions of dollars for research. So whatever little we have to spend it right.
I knew he was the right guy to answer.
I have one quick request to ministry, or since we have a media and a lot of attention here, is that we are really focusing a lot on inviting a lot of technology companies to, make a lot of cheaper smartphones, a lot of tie-ups to make it from India. Why not all these, medicinal devices or pharmaceutical thing, which we can probably make it, if not for very cheaper rate, same quality, but in an affordable rate. I think right now it's too greedy beyond what we can probably do it. Maybe it's more to do with corruption, but I think we really need to really transform this.
So I think, to that question, and since I'm personally involved with many of the initiatives that are happening around, there is a lot of Indian innovation ecosystem which is coming up with world-class products. And it's all happening largely here in Bangalore, right? I'm sure a couple of days back you read about a young man called Rahul Panikar and the company called Embrace Innovations, which has done, and these are all MIT graduates who came back to India and created baby warmers and low-cost baby warmers. So there is tremendous amount of innovation which is happening under the so-called, and those slogans are new. There's Make in India slogans are new, but there is a lot of innovative work which is happening in our back doors and corridors over here, which is giving rise to products which are world beaters at much more lower costs. And I think that is an innovation ecosystem which must continue to thrive in this country. So, when Rishab talked about what is really required, I think what we really need from the government is an ecosystem which makes innovation thrive out of India. So all these youngsters who are coming back, all the companies who are doing India-led innovation and creating products primarily focused to low-cost environments like India, but many of these products will go to the rest of the world. And that is something that needs a lot more motivation on. So there is tons of this good innovation work which is actually happening in India right now. I recently came across a company which is the world's 4th largest suture manufacturer, and he happens to be in India. And Johnson & Johnson of the world buy products from them. So, we don't even know about what is happening in this country sometimes. So there is a lot of good stuff which is happening here.
Two things I want to mention about that. The first is that the largest supplier of generic drugs to McKesson is from India.
Yeah.
And McKesson's the largest wholesale distributor of pharmaceuticals in the United States and Canada. The other thing that's happening is it is so difficult to innovate in the United States, and the environment is so challenging to navigate as an entrepreneur that many of us who advise American or US-based entrepreneurs tell them to begin their innovations in India and China, places where there is the kind of infrastructure that you have, the kind of exciting, intellectually well-educated populations that you have, the kind of entrepreneurial environment that's nascent but still growing. It is an easier place to innovate here and perhaps in China than it is now in the United States with many of these healthcare innovations, simply because healthcare is so fossilized in the United States.
And low cost, David.
Yeah, low cost, absolutely.
So if you talk about low cost innovative products, India should be the home for that.
Yep, I really agree.
Well, at that positive note, I'd like to conclude this discussion. So David, Vishal, Tom, thanks very much for your very useful insights. I hope you also found this quite useful.
Thanks, Rishab.